Welcome, everyone. I'd like to take an opportunity just to introduce Kevin Muir and Jill Julicki from GSP Group and Paradigm Transportation Solutions. Jill will be providing a presentation that's actually going to give the background to the Transportation Master Plan to everyone, as well as some high-level findings over the process. It's extended over a year, and it's to culminate here in December, really, with a draft master plan in front of us. This is a second public engagement session that we're running, and this one deals again with findings and some of the recommendations that Paradigm and GSP Group have found in conjunction with the municipality looking at transportation and transportation futures for the municipality of North Perth. So at this point, I can turn things over to Jill, and she can provide information through a slide presentation on where we've been, what brought us here, and where we're headed as well with transportation here at North Perth. Thanks, Jill.
Excellent for the introduction. And Pat, I'm going to ask you to take me to slide number 2, please. And I want to thank everybody for coming out today to hear our presentation. And as Lyndon mentioned, my name is Jill Julke, and I'm the consultant project manager tasked with overseeing the development and completion of the Transportation Master Plan. And in my Monday to Friday, typically, I'm a senior project manager with Paradigm Transportation Solutions Limited, which is the firm that's been retained to prepare the TMP. And with that, I'm going to take you through the outline of what we're going to cover today, and then we'll get into the presentation a little bit more, and then we'll have time at the end for some discussion. So first, I'm going to give you an overview of what the Transportation Master Plan, what it is, and where we are today. I'll talk a little bit about what we found through phase 1 of the community engagement. And then I'll take you through the main recommendations, which include items for active transportation, road network, truck bypass, and a monitoring program to ensure that everything is being tracked on a routine basis so adjustments can be made as necessary. And then at the very end, we'll discuss the next steps, and then we'll open the floor for a question period. So next slide, please. So what is a Transportation Master Plan? Well, it is a strategic planning document that defines the policies, programs, and infrastructure required to meet the municipality's future transportation needs and to fulfill the transportation vision. So there's a vision for a multimodal transportation system within North Perth through 2041, which was the horizon year of this master plan. It outlines policies, programs, and infrastructure needed to meet the roads, parking, and active transportation needs. It's also sustainable and compatible with the future growth plans for the municipality, Perth County, and the province. So one thing of note with this particular master plan is since it's a first generation document, meaning there is no transportation master plan that came before it, it's largely a policy-driven document where it identifies the policies and guidelines that should be developed to aid in bringing the TMP goals forward. So next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, sorry. There we are. What is not in the municipality's TMP? It doesn't outline minor projects, detailed operational issues, or items that don't affect the long-term direction, meaning it takes a high-level approach to identifying where future capacity may be required, and it supports planned growth or changes in traffic due to ongoing initiatives. But it does not specifically identify where road rehabilitation works may be required, or where site-specific traffic control changes would be required, nor what the operational changes may be at any intersection. And it doesn't give any specific recommendations on on-street parking regulations, meaning it would not bring forward recommendations for a change in bylaw policies regarding parking. It also does not address services that the municipality is not responsible for, such as anything to do with the provincial highways or the Perth County roads. Next slide. And our study goals are to establish a clear vision for the transportation network that will accommodate planned growth. It articulates a made in Perth approach to transportation that aligns with unique community features. So what it does is it recognizes that North Perth is a mix of urban and rural areas and predominantly an auto-centric community. This document provides a policy framework to support sustainable transportation in livable communities. And these are the policies and guidelines that outline requirements such as when and where bicycle parking might be required in the future, where sidewalks should be provided, and things such as that. It provides a policy framework to support sustainable transportation and livable communities. Sorry, we already talked about that. Establishes consistent roadway design practice that meets users' expectations. And this is for future roads and when roads are rehabilitated. And this ensures that the roads are built the same way each time so drivers can have the same experience each time they're on any of the municipal roads. And it conforms to the master planning process, the municipal class environmental assessment. So this is consistent with the approach that the TMP provides a broad level assessment, allowing the plan to serve as the basis for more detailed future investigations if and when required. So next we're on to our study objectives, which the main objective is to end up with a network that is accessible for all ages and abilities and for all road users, meeting not only autos, but cyclists and pedestrians and people with mobility challenges. It aligns with the municipality's strategic plan and supports growth, supports the master growth plan. It results in an expanded pedestrian and cycling network recommendations. Another objective is a truck bypass route options. And we'll get into the specifics of this a little bit later on. It identifies policies required to support the TMP recommendations. And again, we'll get into these in specifics a little bit later through the presentation. And it provides a clear direction for next steps in the planning, building, and maintaining of the transportation network. So a little bit here about our phase 1 community engagement. We had an online survey that ran from about the 1st of June through August of 2020. And it was presented in 2 parts where we had an initial survey and then follow-up questions that dug a little bit deeper into behind the why behind the initial responses. Respondents were able to leave messages and comments on your Say North Perth site. They were allowed to pin points of interest on a map, identifying locations where they believe that there's transportation issues or concerns that should be addressed. And then there was the surveys, which again was conducted in 2 parts. So overall, we had a very high level of participation in that we reached over 1,700 people within the community, meaning that's about how many website visits we had over the course of the process. And we had about 384 people who participated, whether it was through leaving comments, leaving points of interest, or filling out the transportation survey. So in addition, there was a municipal council presentation and one-on-one counselor discussions. And then there was a mail out / email consultation taken with external stakeholders and agencies. So what we heard, this is separated into 2 distinct streams here. So the ones highlighted in blue are what we heard in direct response to transportation issues within the municipality. And then the ones in white with the blue text are the other issues that were highlighted. There's a little bit of crossover between both sections of them, but by and large, the one that had the most responses as being a very important issue was to redirect the truck traffic around downtown Listowel. Of the 162 survey responses, 134 people identified this as a very important issue. The improving traffic conditions within downtown Listowel was identified for 132 respondents as being very important. So overall, between redirecting the truck traffic and improving the traffic conditions, they were pretty equal in that most people felt that they were very important issues that should be addressed. The health and safe opportunities for recreation was identified by 107 respondents, and making it easier to get around North Perth was 103 respondents as identified as very important. So again, these are pretty much equal in terms of importance to the respondents of the survey. And it should also be noted that the key issues here, such as redirecting truck route traffic around downtown Listowel and improving traffic conditions in downtown Listowel, are quite similar to the key issues that were identified by the municipal councillors when we had the one-on-one session. So next slide, please. So within the transportation master plan, There are three planning strategies that could be approached here. So capacity focused strategy, which focuses mainly on autos, demand focused strategy, which is a balance between automobiles and then trying to have a shift over to sustainable and alternative travel modes, or a complete transportation vision strategy, which would be a heavy shift towards sustainable transportation and limiting road capacity, so you would see a shift away from the auto. But because North Perth is mainly an auto-centric community with limited active and alternative transportation options today, and up until this month, I understand that there isn't any transit service either, but it will be coming in shortly. So the planning strategy for the transportation master plan lies between the capacity focused strategy with a bit of a touch towards the demand focused strategy. And as the municipality begins to expand the active transportation network and the supporting facilities, such as bike parking, the successive TMP updates will start to transition more towards the demand focused strategy, and very long term, maybe leaning more towards a complete transportation strategy. So overall, within this TMP, again, it will be more auto focused. However, there is recognition of the steps that need to be taken to develop the active transportation network to get more towards that demand focused strategy. And next slide, please. So within active transportation and future mobility, the TMP is going to provide an interconnected recommendations for an interconnected system of cycling and walking routes, and this is building on your existing network. It's also making recommendations for expanded system of off-road trails, on-road bike lanes, signed bike routes, and sidewalks. Now, a cautionary note here is that this would not be a broad implementation, meaning, for example, in 2037 that bike lanes would be provided on every single road they would go in that year. It makes a recommendation. These types of installations typically are concurrent with road rehabilitation or upgrades. So the TMP doesn't make specific recommendations on the dates for these, but just in general that they should be provided. And another recommendation would be update the zoning bylaws to include bicycle parking rates, meaning, for example, at a commercial development, that the site will be required to provide X bicycle parking spaces in the form of a short-term bike rack based on so many square footage. And that's a recommendation that these rates would be developed over time. And that the active transportation and future mobility also needs to consider the emerging technologies, and in specifically electric vehicles, recognizing that they're becoming more prevalent within society, and now the gas price is raising, there's more of a shift towards the electric vehicles and making them very attractive. So this type of a policy could take the form of a guideline where it outlines that rough-ins for electric vehicles would be required at certain types of development, such as a higher density residential building or at commercial developments over a certain size. And next slide, please. And within this slide, we've identified areas where the spine network in the rural North Perth area could be upgraded that ties in with the existing trail system. So you'll see here that there's one existing trail in the Atwood area, and then the G2G trail down towards the south end of this map. So we're recommending the interconnected routes that would go in, predominantly the municipal routes that would make the full connection throughout the North Perth area and would link all the little communities to Listowel and to themselves. So this would give people many options for how they could traverse through the community. And as well, it would make the community a little bit more attractive to tourists, which is one of the things that were highlighted in the survey, that tourism was a consideration for people and they would like to increase it throughout the municipality. Next slide, please. And here we delve a little bit further into Listowel, recognizing the trail system that is existent here and building upon this. And with this, the goal was to connect the individual components and align it with the future development areas. So making sure when any development plans go in, that it takes consideration for any type of active transportation facilities. And with this network as well, this is in response to some of the direct comments we received through the survey as to where these facilities should be provided throughout Listowel itself. Next slide, please. So we've identified the supporting active transportation policies, programs, and strategies that will support the recommendations throughout the TMP. And the main one is that a municipality should develop an active transportation master plan. And this will identify the preferred facilities, and it would typically assign an anticipated construction date or process for the facility, such as it would occur through rehabilitation or it would be a standalone implementation. And the master plan would include all types of active transportation. So it would be considering walking, cycling, and rolling, or people with mobility issues. Another recommendation is to develop transportation demand management guidelines. And these would typically be applied to any future development that would be implemented within the municipality. And they would outline the requirements such as the bicycle parking rates that would be taken directly from the zoning bylaw once they're provided within it. And would also provide guidelines as to where the bicycle parking should be located and in what form it should take. And what that means is for long-term bicycle parking, let's say in a residential development like a small apartment building, it would say that the bike lockers should be provided within the building for secure long-term storage, whereas short-term bike parking would take the form of bike racks that would be at ground typically located near building entrances. The TDM guidelines would also identify when and where end-of-trip amenities should be provided. And what end-of-trip amenities are, it would be things such as lockers, change rooms, and or showers that people who cycle to and from the area could use. And that would typically be implemented at places of employment, so such as office buildings or if you have any manufacturing facilities. And the TDM guidelines could also identify when and where the rough-ins for electric vehicles are, or how many spaces would have to be reserved in the future for electric vehicles if there was no provision being put in immediately within the development for them. And the vehicle parking selection guidelines, what that is that would be an identification of where small to medium-sized parking lots could be placed adjacent to the trail system where they don't currently exist, which would allow people from outside the area that can't easily cycle to those trails to have access to them. And this could be tied directly into a tourism campaign. And it also makes your trail system more attractive to people because some people, again, aren't as comfortable riding to and from a trail because it may be too far for them. And another component that is recommended is a community outreach program. That includes engineering, education, encouragement, enforcement, and evaluation and planning. This outreach helps raise awareness of active transportation and it helps to promote walking and cycling. And as part of it, you would develop a consistent messaging campaign that could be used across a variety of platforms and audiences. And it would help to illustrate the value of walking and cycling. And it helps to educate individuals about their responsibilities as pedestrians and cyclists. And it just makes the system work a little bit better for everyone when they're aware of what their expectations are. Next slide, please. So we have recommendations for the road network. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, these are not drilling down to intersection-specific recommendations, but overarching policies to help form the transportation network going forward and to ensure that it's going to meet the needs up to 2041. First recommendation is a complete streets pulse implementation. And complete streets are public streets that are planned, designed, and constructed considering the need to comfortably move all people on the road. This means streets that accommodate people of all ages and abilities using a range of travel modes, including walking, cycling, public transit, and driving. And their complete streets are also meant to establish safe, comfortable, and barrier-free environments for moving people through communities that provide a diversity of options for non-automotive travel and provide options for active and healthy living. So again, this is not something that will be immediately implemented, but as new roads go in new development areas, or when you're really rehabilitating your existing streets, then the complete streets policy would be implemented. The road network hierarchy is a recommendation where ensuring that roads are assigned appropriate classifications for the network, and in doing so, the classification would meet the intended function, whether it would be to move vehicles, which is what an arterial roadway typically does, or to provide land access, which is the function of a local road. And it's also tied to traffic volumes and the way people are using the road. Correct location, supports specific types of upgrades and or studies that could be completed. So a case in point is the Wallace Street South traffic calming initiative that was recently undertaken within Listowel. And at the start of this, Wallace South was classified as an arterial roadway, which took it out of consideration for traffic calming because it's typically only conducted on collector and local roadways. Once Wallace was reclassified as a collector roadway, we undertook a traffic calming study for it, and it resulted in the form that you see today with the edge lines painted on the roadway and the pedestrian crossover being provided at cross. The TMP identifies some of the future road needs in such that it doesn't specifically examine the entire network, but it identifies where new roads may be required to support development or where general capacity issues may be expected in the future. And this is typically this goes hand in hand with the development areas and looking at those areas specifically, but not on like a general intersection level, but a broad overview level. And it identifies the road needs to ensure the municipality can ensure any required right-of-way early in the process. Access management guidelines have been identified as something that will support the TMP going forward, in that it will provide direction to developers, planners, and consultants on best practices in access management. And access management guidelines outline the permitted types of accesses, control considerations such as spacing, how close together they would be allowed. And a lot of that is a function of the type of roadway and the land that's being accessed. Yes, everyone, that's Johnny. He loves meetings. Design elements of accesses, such as the angle of the intersection with the roadway and how to mitigate the impacts of the access. And that can be a function of the location of it, or the type of access that is permitted. And it would be looking at a holistic approach to access management. And then we have some recommended improvements for the road network that will outline the types of improvements that should be considered going forward for the road network, but without specifically delving into the assessment of each intersection within the municipality. Meaning it would outline that roundabouts could be a consideration, changes in traffic control, such as going from stop signs to signals where warranted, or changing from a 2 to a 4-way stop, or from a 4-way to a 2-way stop controlled intersection. Next slide, please. We've identified 6 traffic safety policies that should be developed to support the TMP. And the first one is the traffic calming policy, which I briefly spoke about traffic calming before. And this would provide the process for receiving and reviewing traffic calming requests. And then it would outline the steps to assess what, if any, traffic control should be considered for the street and area. And it would also outline things such as if a request has been put in for a specific street, but it did not meet the criteria for traffic calming, it would state how long of a time period would have to lapse before a successive application could be brought forward for that piece of roadway again. The next policy is an all-way stop control policy. And this is a means to adopt an all-way policy that will provide the municipality with clear and consistent guiding principles regarding the need for installation of all-way stop control at intersections. And just as a side note, all-way stop controls are not a form of traffic calming. So when we talk about traffic calming and all-way stop control, they kind of go hand in hand because one is not part of the other. They're 2 distinct things that need to be handled in 2 separate ways because they have a different criteria that need to be met and different end results to be met. Another policy is the speed limit policy that will outline the preferred streets within the municipality where lower speed limits could be implemented, such as in school zones, or it could outline if the municipality has a desire to lower the overall speed limit within it, how that will be achieved. And as well, that goes hand in hand with that would be a speed management program for local and collector roads within the residential communities to ensure that the speed limit policy and any lowered speed limits are achieving the intended function of actually slowing down traffic. A pedestrian crossing policy is recommended, and this could build on the existing PXO studies that's been undertaken within Listowel. It could be expanded on and brought into the other built up areas of the municipality where there may be heavier volumes of pedestrian activity. And as such, all the work should be undertaken based on the guidance provided within the Ontario Traffic Manuals, Book 15, Pedestrian Crossing Treatments. A school zones and community safety zone policy. The implementation of these two types of zones enable the municipality to focus resources and attention on specific location where safety risks to vulnerable road users is highest, and that it would ensure that your roads are designed appropriately, and it would take into considerations things such as the need for pedestrian crossings to accommodate the vulnerable road users and to make sure that they're accommodated in the safest manner possible. And the last policy is a roundabout policy that outlines when and where roundabout traffic control should be considered and how the needs should be assessed, where it could go so far as to identify the types of software that would be acceptable for the assessment of the roundabouts themselves. So next slide, please. And now we're going to get into talking about the recommended truck bypass routes. And as you'll see here, we have two of them outlined. We've identified a preferred route and an alternative route. And the reason that there's two is that by the time you're completed all the studies in the assessment, you may find that one is preferred over the other for many reasons. So the ultimate routing will be determined by the length and attractiveness of the detour, recognizing that if the detour is too long and takes too much time, then it doesn't become attractive and will not achieve the desired results. Another question to ask is, does it reflect good planning and engineering practice? Meaning, will it reduce conflict between different road users and achieve the intended goal? Or some routes might be on roads that have higher pedestrian volumes, so you might rule that out because it wouldn't be attractive from a safety perspective, even though it might be a shorter route. So regardless of the route, in order for any of the bypasses to be successful, it has to be supported by a consistent education and enforcement campaign to ensure that only local trucks destined to points within Listowel are actually going into downtown and all the other trucks are using the bypasses. And the education form of this could be conversations with trucking companies that are reported as going through downtown that are not destined origin to places within downtown, having conversations with them and reminding them that once a bypass is implemented, this is where you would like their trucks to be going. And if you couple that with an enforcement campaign within the downtown core, eventually the message will get through that only local trucks should be located within downtown and everything else should be on the bypass. And without the enforcement piece, the bypass will not be as successful as you want it to be, because regardless, you're asking people to drive a longer distance, which takes more time. And and again, any improvements that are made to the downtown core, which improve traffic operations, is something that would also dissuade people from using a bypass, because they would again weigh it against, it's going to take additional time to use the bypass. Why should I when I could go through downtown because it's faster? So it's really important to have the enforcement component in with the bypass truck routes. And these routes were taken from previous work conducted by Paradigm within a traffic report from 2016. And they were refined slightly to bring the routes closer in on the east side towards downtown Listowel, because originally we had one of the routes a little bit further out to the east, and it was just a little too far away, and it looked like it wasn't going to be as attractive of a route. So regardless, as you're getting into analyzing these, I think the cost benefit analysis will be the determining factor in whether you go through the preferred route or the alternative route option here. So next slide, please. And one of the things that you need to do to ensure that you're moving forward in a successful manner is to develop a monitoring program. And once you develop it, you have to implement it. And it means for the entire transportation system. So it's not just limited strictly to roads, it's monitoring things such as your collision data to ensure that any areas of high collision activity are being addressed from a functional design perspective as well as an operations perspective. Be looking at any transit data that comes in on your ridership once your route goes into play in Listowel, and seeing what the shift is and how many people are using it, which can impact decisions going forward. You look at your trail data to see how many people are using trails and is your trail system able to accommodate the influx of any new users that you may have. Want to look also at pedestrians, which is part of that pedestrian policy, pedestrian crossings policy, to make sure you're accurately planning and accommodating any pedestrians. And you also want to look at parking. So typically you would set performance measures and targets to track after you've identified how frequently you're going to monitor. And typically you would monitor in a 3 to 5 year cycle, depending on what it is you're monitoring. You set up your performance measures. For example, one of the things that you might identify is, for example, by 2025, you wanted to have one bike rack in all the municipal facilities within the municipality. That's something that would be easy to track and monitor how you're progressing towards that goal. And another performance measure and target is a stakeholder consultation on a routine basis. So after you've implemented something such as the bike parking at municipal facilities program, you could put a survey up on Your Say North Perth to gather feedback from the community as to how well it's working. Is it an adequate supply of bike parking? Do you need to add more? So going out to your stakeholders, and it can be in a more passive capacity, but just to gather the information and their feedback to make sure you're pointed in the right direction. And then the other thing you can do is explore data sources that help with monitoring, such as the Waze traffic data. There's a mine, you can mine that data to get a whole bunch of feedback on things such as delay through your downtown. So there's many sources that you can have that pull into your monitoring program. And there is some guidance that is out there in the field of various publications that guide on this, and some of the recommendations from those will be put into the TMP as to where you can go for that specific guidance on your monitoring program. And next slide, please. So the next steps in the process here is we're going to address the feedback received from this evening's session, and we will include that as part of the TMP. Then we're going to finalize the Transportation Master Plan report, and there will be a formal presentation to Municipal Council. And next slide, please. As far as feedback submission goes, questions can be submitted to tmpstudy@northperth.ca or a phone call to Lyndon, and there's a couple of phone numbers there. Or the other option is general feedback through the Your Say North Perth site. And by the end of this week, there will be a follow-up survey that will be posted on the Your Say North Perth site, where we're going to ask the public and any of the counselors to provide specific answers to questions about the direction of the TMP and any follow-up information that they would like to provide. And now I'm going to open the floor to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Jill. We usually can speak in the chat room just by saying yes or question mark if you do have a question. An awful lot of data, a lot of research, and the public participation was impressive, and we did get a lot of feedback from it. So we'll be able to digest all that. But if you do have specific questions on any of the comments, please just note in the chat, and we can certainly go through them with you. Thanks, Leanne. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lyndon, and through you, I was excited to see the work that's been done on this master plan. I have a question for Jill. So Jill, you gave us a really good outline as to how a master transportation strategy works. Will there be more information about recommendations around more specific things? And I'm looking at, for instance, active transportation routes and cycling. Is there going to be more specific information or recommendations for the municipality to consider? If you could first answer that, that'd be great. Thanks.
And the answer is yes, there is. So I didn't want to go into too much detail in here because I wanted to give an overview. So within the active transportation section of the TMP, it's a rather fleshed out section. And it talks about all the measures that can be taken and all the assessment practices that go into it. And then the recommendations on the Trails Network themselves of how we got from A to B in developing the recommended network. So one of the things that we did do in the background is we did do counts at the trail access points and on the trails to have an idea of how they're being used, to as well assess what we'll call a bit of a level of service for them to make sure that the trails are able to accommodate the demand. And those counts were undertaken about a year ago. So during the height of the pandemic was when everybody was out and about, and we found that right now we have good capacity. But again, it helped us form the recommendations going forward. So when you see the TMP itself, it does have a lot of information about AT and all forms of AT going forward.
Councillor Rothwell has a question. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Lyndon, and thank you, Jill, for your presentation. In the your comments, we talk about, or you mentioned specifically about how the master transportation plan is for North Perth roads, but we clearly know that provincial highway and county roads are part of our network, which is important for moving people, goods, and services. And my question specifically is input that certainly council has heard, and I'm sure you heard in the public information session or public surveys about the need for potential roundabouts to address traffic concerns at, for example, Line 87 and Provincial Highway 23 north of Listowel, as well as Line 84 and Highway 23 on the south end of Listowel, among other locations. So my question is, even though you say specifically in the presentation is that county roads and provincial highways are not part of the plan, I'd like to hear your comments about how we can address concerns about the interaction between traffic that's on local North Perth roads as it interacts with the provincial highway or county road. Thanks very much.
So I will say that you know, recognizing you do have the connecting link roadways. So just to clarify, the intent of we don't address provincial highways is meaning we wouldn't do something outside the municipality that wasn't a connecting link. We would not comment on that. So in this context, for example, at 23 and 86, I believe it is, which is 87, sorry. So that intersection is identified as part of the truck bypass route. So while within this specific transportation master plan, we're not drilling down to that intersection and saying should put a roundabout here, or you should consider it. The broad context is at locations where you realize that there will be traffic issues going forward, or they're recognized today, that an acceptable form of traffic control to mitigate that would be a roundabout. And in that specific location of Highway 23 and Line 87, because it is identified as being part of the truck bypass route, then it would be recommending further study as part of that truck bypass route is what the ultimate configuration of that intersection needs to look like. Where if you're accommodating trucks, then you would have to design a roundabout large enough that would accommodate those trucks, which in some instances you may end up not having enough right of way to implement that roundabout. Therefore, you would pull back and maybe look at just providing a typical signalized intersection there, or making improvements to it as far as capacity goes. So we don't drill down into it, but it's a recommendation of further study in areas where you've identified that there's a problem and that roundabouts should be considered.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Andreessen. Again, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Couch. Again, addressing through you a question to Jill. I'm just wondering, you mentioned that there would be a formal report that we'd be able to review some of the specific recommendations. Is that going to be forthcoming, or have I missed that? Thank you.
is forthcoming. And Linda and I are just coordinating on what that date is going to be and when it's forthcoming, but it is. And then typically we would give you a minimum of a 2-week review period before we would give a presentation to you to familiarize yourselves with it before we brought it in front of you.
Thanks. Mayor Todd, I believe, has a question. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Couch, and a question for the consultant. I mean, I think there was a lot of interest in what would be proposed with regards to a truck bypass route, a file that has 70 years of history, as I'm sure you discovered in your work on this. I find myself interested in the question of whether you have considered future residential development, possible activities in choosing that route. And in particular, of course, we're aware that on Tremaine at this point, there is an approved plan of subdivision to the east side of that street that is substantial, and whether it would be appropriate to pass trucks down Tremaine, given that degree of residential development, is an interesting question, which I'd just like you to confirm that you've considered that and other potential future residential development along those routes.
I can confirm that yes, we have. Hence the preferred route and the alternative route. And then Lyndon and I did discuss this yesterday, actually. And we decided to leave the map the way it is. I mean, it looks very symmetrical and very nice. But recognizing that, it doesn't mean that's the best implementation. Because in our discussions, recognizing that development that's planned for Tremaine Road and the fact that there's schools on the west side of Tremaine Road, that this is an area that has will will have higher pedestrian activity and has been identified as potentially requiring a pedestrian crossover. So while it is identified here as a preferred route, in those discussions, it's come to light that it will likely, after all of the assessment, be put on the alternative back burner, and then would shift our focus to Road 153 as the preferred alternative because it is outside the developed area. And I understand that there are some issues with that location, but it does take it away from the populace and it removes the conflict between autos and pedestrians and trucks, which is always preferred from this kind of a standpoint for trucks.
Thanks, Jill. Councillor Behrens, please.
Thank you, Lyndon, and thank you, Jill. This is extensive information, and it's nice to hear. I know a lot of information has gone into it, and I thank you for your presentation. My question is kind of similar to Mayor Todd's, in that how much work did you actually look at in the movement of traffic? Not necessarily like I know a lot of this information session has been focused around Listowel as the urban center, but has anything else been done in the entire North Perth to kind of develop a road network? You mentioned something about a road hierarchy, and that's the first part of my question. But the second part of my question is, have you looked at the zoning and that of lands surrounding the urban center, and not just the subdivisions, but you know, the recreation facilities and things like that, to know where traffic may or may not be going? I mean, it's one thing to move it through, it's another thing to have a true understanding of where it's going. And I'm just wondering how much was did you investigate that? Thanks.
Sure. And I'll tackle road hierarchy. So yeah, I will agree that a lot of the TMP is listable based because it is your urban center. And that's where the predominant traffic is occurring within the municipality. but we are taking the broad overview of looking at the road network within the entirety of the municipality for any kind of classification changes. And so far right now in your other, what I'll call them, your hamlet areas, your road network, it's an arterial roadway or it's a local roadway, and it seems to be consistent with the way the roads are being used. And in terms of where people are going, meaning to attractors such as a recreation center or schools or things like that, we're focusing on where there's going to be areas of new development to make sure that we're appropriately providing providing the appropriate roadway to support that development. And in terms of existing, unless we've identified a problem, meaning that there's a capacity issue, like in general, that's affecting the network operations, we're not looking down at that intersection level or specific land use level of there's a problem here. But again, if it's something that's planned for the future, that it's being considered as part of what you need to plan for to accommodate that going forward.
Just as follow-up to the comment regarding planning in the future, the OP draft for the county, as well as settlement area discussions and any information that was coming through the county's official plan amendments was also transferred into this process. And we kept a close eye on that as well. It helped to indicate areas of growth and areas of change, not only in Listowel, but also in the Atwood area, and they were considered and part of the TMP. I'm not seeing any additional questions. We've covered a lot of ground. Again, we'll be able to, Councillor Rothwell has a question. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Linda. I appreciate that. And another question for Jill, and not to go too far into the issue, but certainly you're aware that the desire to see recommendations on the truck bypasses around Listowel is a high priority. I'm just wondering if you can share with us some of the thought behind bringing the preferred alternative right into the edge of Listowel in terms of Tremaine Ave South, Road 158. And especially in light of the fact that there's a school and industrial areas there, as well as residential areas, as opposed to going further to the east. Thank you.
Sure. So I will say that this goes all the way back to the study we undertook in 2016. So we brought that forward. And the reason that Tremaine was left on the route is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, you don't want to make your bypass too long because then it becomes unattractive. So again, it was yesterday, and where Lyndon and I had the discussion that Tremaine should have been flipped and become not necessarily the alternative, the preferred, but it was left on here because it was originally identified as that because it is a truck route now. There's trucking companies along there. It is functioning as an arterial roadway as to date, which that's its intended function, is to move traffic. So it was preferred from a length perspective, but the main recommendation of everything that we're doing here is going to be to do that cost benefit analysis and a real deep dive into the planning behind for the areas behind this is what it's going to take to implement the bypasses. And another consideration for Tremaine as well is that it is an existing road that is open and operating, where it's my understanding that Road 153 has its challenges further to the east and would have to be opened. So again, this is a developing thing. So right now we left Tremaine as preferred, but recognizing that there has to be a lot of study done before you settle on your final bypass routing.
Thank you.
Just as additional comment again, there's a considerable amount of policy that was discussed tonight, and Jill alluded to that at the beginning, very much in fact. So in one way, it's exciting because once we adopt the master plan, and integrate some of the policies. You know, there'll be several years as we move along that process, the bypassing, the status of arterial roads, etc., and making those changes will be all part of that. And we did, as Jill said, discuss the bypass routing and the options. We looked at other options as well, and those could very much be brought forward in a more final product. So those considerations have been made, and we'll take these comments back, and they've been very valuable, and they point out some of the issues that we've already discussed, and we can bring back you know, new thoughts on it and a more final product in terms of the input that was brought tonight. The input tonight, as Jill had said, is important and was to be integrated in and then responded to as we bring a final master plan forward in the December-January window. And we'll go back to Councillor Rothwell now. Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks very much, and not to go on too long, but we've had conversations in public as well as around the council table regarding our roads located outside of Listowel that are utilized by rural traffic and certainly for farm equipment. And the concern is the width of those roads and what we can do to ensure safety of our farmers and the farming community, as well as those that are traveling on the roads. And how is there anything in the master plan? I didn't hear anything specifically, but that we can try to deal with in terms of ensuring roads that are, whether they be gravel or whether they be narrow country roads, and with the size of equipment, what we can do to ensure safety of our farmers and with their equipment as well as traffic. Thank you.
So it goes hand in hand with a recommendation from the active transportation portion of the TMP, in such that the recommendation is that when you're rehabilitating or upgrading the roads, that you would allow where possible for a 1 meter paved shoulder on any paved road. So what it does is it essentially widens your platform to give you 2 meters of additional space for accommodating both, you know, agricultural vehicles and autos, but that 1 meter paved shoulder can function as a bike route as well. So it has a dual purpose in doing that. So that's the main recommendation we're going to give for how to accommodate the agricultural vehicles, because we recognize that there's constrained environments, and in some places it's just not feasible to widen roadways beyond the 2 meters, and in some cases even the 2 meters could be a big ask. So that is the recommendation going forward, is where possible widen with those shoulders.
Thank you.
Councillor Andreessen, thank you.
Yes, thank you through you, Mr. Couch. Just as I look at the bypass possibility with Road 157 and Line 87, with traffic turning left to, you know, go on to Line 87 from 157, there is a hill there. And so the sight lines there for moving traffic from that road 157 onto line 87 would be a bit concerning as they make that left. Is that something that intersection would, you know, if that were to happen, would work have to be done on that intersection in order to improve those sight lines to make it safer for traffic to turn? If you could comment on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
The simple answer is yes. So work should be done to give the best sight lines as possible. So as part of the trying to think of the word that I'm looking for here. Sorry, my brain just went blank on me. The work being undertaken to assess the bypass routing, those are the things that would have to be looked at, and that would be part of the total analyses that would have to be done going forward. So you would look at the route itself and all of the improvements that would have to be implemented in order for that route to be brought forward, and then you would do the cost benefit analysis of it. So in a case like that, you may have extensive earthworks that have to take place in order to give the required sight lines there. So all of that has to be taken in consideration for the entirety of the routes. And as Lyndon said earlier, like this is the jumping off point for where the routes are. But as you go forward through that assessment, you may realize that some of these have to come off the table because they're just cost prohibitive.
Thank you. That's helpful to think about these options in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Barron has a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Lyndon. Through you. I'm just wondering about the last statement, though. Like, if you already know, and if it's where I believe it is, that corner is not going to really function well as a truck bypass corner. So I'm just wondering why you would even suggest it in the master plan if you already know that fundamentally it's going to not work really well or be very cost prohibitive. Do you understand what I mean? Like if you're bringing forward options, I would have thought that a little bit more thought would have been put into how realistic are these? Because sometimes master plans um, suggest things that really aren't economically feasible to begin with, and when there's other options that could have been considered that might have been better. So to throw it out as something that might be an option, but to know really in the back of your mind it probably is cost prohibitive just doesn't make sense to me. That's my comment.
And this was brought forward solely from an access perspective of looking at trying to reduce the length of the bypass and then understanding that, yes, it at the end of the day, it could be cost prohibitive. However, when you would compare it to, let's say, the easterly option of Road 152, depending on all the amount of work that would have to be undertaken to upgrade that road to bring it up to the standard that will be required to accommodate trucks, and the additional part of line 87 that might have to be upgraded, at the end of the day, the costs could be very similar. And then that would be a decision that would have to be made internally about the threshold for, do you have the money to go forward with this? And how are you going to achieve that goal?
I can also add that we did review some of the technical aspects of these roadways that are in front of you. 157, just as a way of an example, there's a hydro transformer station in the next crossing to the east, which is very difficult to move and work with. Obviously, we've mentioned things like roundabouts. It's not outside the realm of possibility that when these intersections get looked at, land acquisitions are going to be very much a part of road widenings, especially where you have elevated roads where we simply can't widen a road unless we own more property on the sides of them. 66 feet may not be adequate. We already saw this in some of the work that we've done on Road 165. So there's very much in front of us in terms of doing a detailed analysis on the engineering and the changes that have to happen. But we'll continue to review it. As I said, we looked at the options. Hydro pole lines are another large factor. Some of them have been placed very tight to the existing roadway. The entire hydro pole line on some of these sections will have to be moved at very significant cost and very significant time and planning and working with the utility. So they are years away. But this is the first step. And these comments, as I said, are going to be taken back, and we're going to look at those. It's easier on the west side by the looks of things because we've already developed a lot of the infrastructure. On the east side, not as much, but we'll be taking a closer look over the next weeks and be able to come back probably with a primary and secondary option again that reflects, some of the discussion we've had and a little bit more investigation. Mayor Kastenberg, thank you.
Thanks, Lyndon. Just to sort of follow that to its natural conclusion, what I'm hearing in general from my colleagues is that there's interest in seeing, at least for the proposed possibilities for bypass, the obstacles or barriers that might be sort of macro barriers that would be in the way. And I'm hoping that perhaps as we move forward, that those macro barriers are at least documented for our consideration. I know that we're not going to get down to sort of engineering level or feasibility study level through the process of finalizing the transportation master plan, but I think councillors are saying, and I'm agreeing with them, that at least having that macro sense of what the barriers are for each of the options is rather important.
Yes, thanks. We will integrate that kind of information into the master plan process. I really have to, Jill educated me on this, and so did the other consultants. I had the same questions and the same comments because I have a greater understanding of what lies on the ground at these bypass areas. But just in response, it again is a bypass that's designed for, and I'll try and use the words they used for me, for the existing traffic, but future traffic as well to 2041, the build out period of this master plan. And what that means is the timing is so essential. A bypass needs to be as short and as efficient as possible. And so those roads are chosen on a timing study as a major priority, not so much a technical engineering process, but the technical and the engineering can be changed, and they may mean additional costs, but we have to keep in mind the bypass locations are listed for that efficiency, and Jill could add to that. But that was the answer I got when I asked some of these same questions.
Yes, so that's our initial jumping off point. Like I stressed before, is like you have to keep your bypass short enough so it's attractive. Where I did a very, very quick assessment as Linda and I were working through this process a few weeks ago, what the travel time is if you stayed on the highway and you went through Listowel versus the bypass. And, if you took the southerly bypass, it could add 6 minutes to your travel time, which is okay from an operations perspective and an attractiveness perspective. But if you know, that's via Tremaine Road. But if you stretched out to 153, it doubled in time. So it's an additional 12 minutes of travel time. So that's not looking as attractive to trucks for them to go 12 minutes out of the way, because a lot of times they're on really tight time frames and they got to meet certain delivery targets. So it's a combination of making sure that it's short enough to be attractive enough and easy enough to enforce as well. Because if you keep it shorter and tighter in, then the patrol route for the enforcement vehicles is that much shorter. And it also gives you a little bit more control over what's going into and out of your downtown. But again, this is like the very high level approach to it. And those are the things that feed in. But as Linda and I work through the process, it'll probably help guide us towards maybe some different conclusions than what you're hearing here today, as far as what the recommended and the alternatives are.
Councillor Rothwell, thank you.
Thanks very much, Lyndon. And my just further question about the potential truck route options. And again, Jill, you mentioned our sort of time frame going through to 2041. And the concern I have is in terms of the location on Tremaine Ave South or Road 158. For the longer term, I suspect we're going to see more significant build outs in that area. And when we talk about the shorter or bringing it in tighter, frankly, I think it's short-sighted to look at that. And I look at Orangeville being an example of truck bypass, which years ago seemed to work well, but now is clogged with development, which makes it, frankly, less appealing as a truck route option. And I think that we need to learn from that sort of experience to make sure that our truck route's going to last a little bit longer than the prescribed time here of 2041. We can always move a truck route, I realize that, but I'm just concerned about the bringing a truck route in right to the edge of a list like that. Thank you.
Thanks. as Jill had said, we've been speaking about this with the development of the subdivision on the east side of Tremaine Avenue and the potential of pedestrian access, even crossing that road mid-block. You know, traffic signals, etc., could be developed in the future. So again, I'll just repeat what we've said. You know, those options can change. We'll review these comments, probably look at some of the technical aspects, maybe consult if there's time. We do want to get the master plan launched and in front of council, but we want it to be a very good product that can be utilized. But if there's time, we can use a civil engineering firm probably to comment on some of those technical issues and some of the costs as well. I don't know whether that'll be alongside this work, and Jill can let me know. The TMP may go forward, but that could be additional information that could be provided to council so that we're informed now about some of these very large costs that could be a consequence of some of these options. But I'll leave that with Jill in terms of overall timing and if that'll change our overall process or not.
I think one of the things that we could do now to move the TMP forward and to get it completed is we can just simply put this as identified routes and identify all of this. So we take out the preferred and the alternative. These are identified options. And then leave it that the further study would be required for each of these to determine what the optimum routing should be. I think that's just the easiest way at this point in time to move everything forward. And then that opens the door for further study on everything.
Okay, thanks, Jill. A question from Councillor Andreessen. I could read that. What would be the time frame for moving forward with a truck bypass? We had this discussion as we talked about short and long-term strategies with the downtown core and the one-way block. So there's another consultant that we used for that, and they that's Julia Salvini, and we discussed, and it was mentioned in her presentation that there's a limit likelihood of a 5-year window before we see any implementation of a truck bypass functioning, especially in totality. And it's mainly because of the land acquisition. The other agencies that are involved, they might be the county, they might be the MTO as well, but there'll be a lot of approvals. So that process is the long-term issue that we've been dealing with. And this transportation master plan is in front of us to deal with the long-term. The short and mid-term was dealt with, you know, through that other consulting process and some of those trials that we're doing. But 5 years was the number that they had come up with. And we'll see if we can make more sense of that and maybe give some information in the TMP about that to council when we come back with a final product. I see another question from Councillor Andreessen. Is this totally funded by the municipality? I'd have to say that that wouldn't be fully known at this point. There could be funding dollars available, but the majority of the roads being under our authority entirely would mean that that would be a cost borne by the municipality. This is very high level right now. There could be funding opportunities as part of it, but that's the way I'd be budgeting it and putting it in front of council in a 5-year plan. And I can look at that more closely as I, you know, put together a capital budget that would show what this all means over the next 5-year window. And back to Councillor Rothwell for a question.
Thanks very much, Lyndon. Jill, something totally different. So I did see on the one slide where we were talking about trails and so on, and I note the one that you have that's the former railway right-of-way called the Newton subdivision, which is located southeast of Listowel. And I'm just concerned that is listed on there. And the reason, like part of our farm, for example, or all of our farm had the railway right-of-way come through. We're just located southeast of Britain. The majority of the land, as I understand, was actually put up for sale through Elma Township at the time, and the majority, if not all of the property owners purchased that property. And in our case, if you drive by our farm, there is no indication of any railway right-of-way whatsoever. it's totally cultivated field, and I'm concerned with the inclusion of that former line on the map showing the location of the former railroad way, that it may give a false impression. So I'm not sure the extent of work that was undertaken to include that, but I just want to make you aware that in many cases that I'm aware of in this area, all of that land is now under the ownership of mostly farm, but there are some residential properties, at least in Britain, and certainly as we go further in closer to Listowel. Thank you.
Lyndon, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I had redlined that, and I'm not sure if I got that version back to Jill, but that's noted. There were some other alternatives. So when you see another draft of this, that's probably going to be recognized. That is noted. As I said, we discussed it, but I don't think it got to this version. It's private property, and there was another alternate route looked at. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any additional questions. I want to say that this has been very productive. It's an excellent opportunity to have more of an intimate conversation really regarding what our findings are. To this point, it's been municipal staff and the public that have commented. And this has been a benefit in terms of, looking at final recommendations. We're going to consider all of these. As I said, we might get some other consultation done in terms of some of the civil works that are in the background of some of the proposal. I like what Jill has said in terms of just showing feasible options at this point and then diving into them further, but still being able to bring the master plan forward and also putting a process in place to make sure that it does get finalized once we have the right information, especially on the bypass. Another question here, is there any consideration in the plan for horse-drawn transportation, safety and parking, etc.? I'll let Jill answer that.
So I will say we are not making specific recommendations on horse-drawn transportation per se. So we recognize that I know that you have parking in your main lot within Listowel. So we're not recommending any changes to parking. We're not bringing specifics for that, but that's a conversation that Lyndon and I can have in our next meeting, and we can discuss that and what those needs might be.
One additional item was that the county and the MTO are stakeholders. I know as I discuss with the MTO, as we discuss as a municipality, the widening of their shoulders and bike lanes and a widening of their work as a resurfacing project coming up from the south from Mitchell north. They are addressing some of those issues. So it's some of those main corridor roads that already transition through Listowel specifically. They're addressed through those other basic road authorities. So we can make a comment about what they're doing. And as I said, they are stakeholders and they're addressing their road platforms, their 100-foot road allowances really do allow for that to happen. But we'll comment on that and we'll discuss it more as Jill had said. Thank you. Okay, I think that's winding down. I just want to thank everyone who participated and thank you very much for the input, the questions, and some of the detail that was provided for us as we bring, as I keep saying, a final product forward. I'd like to thank everyone who participated. Kevin's in the background. He dealt a lot with the planning background behind and the communication with the transportation master plan to date. Thanks to Jill for the presentation and thanks to all of you who have attended as well. We look forward to seeing you again soon in terms of meeting with council and bringing forward final drafts and then addressing the comments and putting them all together in a final product again. So I think on that note, just looking over at Pat here, what we'll do is adjourn. I'm not seeing any other questions coming forward. If they do come forward, absolutely, the phone number's there. The TMP study is there as an email address, as well as my own personal email address at the municipality as manager of operations. Thanks again. And we'll say good night to everyone. We'll see you when we come forward with the next step of the process on the TMP. Good night.